After wrapping up her freshman year in college, Jessie came back to live with her parents for the summer. She was often writing original music with her friend Dan Bartelt, who was also a very talented local musician. That summer, she had auditioned for and landed a central role in that summer's musical. They had a matinee performance at 2 p.m. After that matinee, Jessie and the rest of her castmates headed off to another cast member's house who had a pool, and they had a big pool party. Jessie would finally leave the party and get back to her parents' house sometime after midnight. The next morning, Buck and Joy got up fairly early, around 7 a.m., and Jessie, she stayed in bed. At around noon, Joy would leave her office and head back home. When she walked into her home, she was expecting to see Jessie awake. But when she walked inside, the house was silent. Jessie was not downstairs. She apparently was not awake. She opens the door up. Jessie's still in bed, and so Joy runs over to her to jostle her awake. But as soon as she is standing right over her daughter, she would call 911.
Hartford 911, what's your emergency?
My daughter is blue. I went to wake her up, and I just got home from lunch, and she won't wake up.
Okay, so is she breathing?
I don't think so, no. It looks like strangulation marks.
There are strangulation marks?
That's what it looks like.
When police and paramedics arrived moments later, they came into the bedroom and they quickly determined that Jessie was deceased. When police looked at Jessie's body, they too saw the marks on her neck, and they also saw the same ligature marks on her left wrist and also on her ankles. The police on scene quickly concluded this was a homicide. The police were not able to find any cord or rope or ligatures that could have been used to strangle Jessie to death. The police also noted that there was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house, and it appeared nothing in the house was stolen. The killer knew Jessie and targeted Jessie. When Detective Thickens spoke with Buck and Joy, he asked them if they had any idea who would want to hurt their daughter. And at first, the parents said, no, we don't know anyone. But after some more prodding, Joy would point out to the detective that the night before, when Jessie came home, she had seemed really upset about something. She had said it was about these two guys that, were hitting on her at the party, and it made her uncomfortable. But Joy and Jessie didn't really get into it. Detective Thickens found them, and he very quickly ruled out one of them, but he was not able to rule out the other. His name was Randy Talley. When Detective Thickens spoke to Randy, Randy would tell him that after the party, he went back to his apartment, and that is where he has been the entire time until right then. When Detective Thickens asked him if there was anyone that could corroborate his story, Randy said no, he was alone in his apartment the entire time. The police were still searching Jessie's bedroom for evidence, and they discovered her diary. And her final entry in this diary only made Randy seem more suspicious. After Jessie had spoken with her mom briefly when she got back from the party, she had gone up to her room and then made this final diary entry. And in it, she talks about being really upset about what these two guys had done to her. She said that these two guys were corrupting her and that they were taking what should be platonic love and perverting it into a competition. Her closing lines seemed to indicate that she might have been expecting some sort of future confrontation with these two guys. The lines read, "I am not helpless. I will recognize problems and confront them without fear. God be with me." Randy quickly became the primary suspect in this murder investigation. But Randy's cell phone records indicated that he had not had any interaction, no calls, no text messages, with Jessie leading up to her death. And around the time when she would have been killed, Randy's cell phone was in his apartment, far away from Jessie's house. So the Hartford police had to go back to the drawing board and try to find new leads to chase down. Just 24 hours after Jessie was discovered, the police would get a huge lead. 3 days before Jessie was killed, a young woman about the same age as Jessie, named Melissa Richards, decided to take her dog for a walk in a park about 10 miles southeast. When Melissa pulled her car into the dirt parking lot, she noticed there was only one other car parked in this lot. And she noticed the driver had their legs poking out of the driver's side window. She parks her car, she hops out, she gets her little dog Remy out of the car, and then she walks away from the parking lot and heads onto the walking trail into the woods. And so Melissa does a 30-minute loop So she gets all the way around and she reaches the entrance to the parking lot, and she sees the blue minivan is still parked where it was, except the driver no longer has their feet poking out of the window. And so she lets go of the leash of Remy, and Remy starts running to the car, and Melissa pulls out her key fob and she opens up the trunk to the car, and so Remy runs over, he leaps into the car, and then Melissa just continues to walk across the lot towards her vehicle. She turns to look at the blue minivan. The driver is now sitting in the passenger seat. The door is open, and this person is sitting there staring at Melissa. But after averting her gaze, she hears the sound of someone running towards her from behind. And so she whips her head around and she sees the driver of this van has run up to her. And as soon as she turned around to face this person, they came to a complete stop and they were just staring directly at Melissa. They were only about 10 feet apart. And Melissa kind of reflexively said, "Oh, you scared me." And then Melissa just turned her back on this person and continued walking towards her vehicle. And after taking only a couple of steps, once again, she heard the sound of this person behind her start running towards her. And immediately she whips her head around again and again. This person comes to an abrupt stop as soon as Melissa's looking at them. Except now Melissa knows something's not right. And worst of all, she looks down, and in this person's right hand by their hip is a knife. A split second later, this person charges Melissa. They tackle Melissa to the ground. Melissa smashes down onto her stomach, and she's pinned on her stomach. And this person, they attempt to stab Melissa, but Melissa fights back like mad. She turns over and she grabs the blade of the knife, and she wrestles it away from her attacker, and she pulls the knife under her body, and she puts it under all of her weight. And the attacker is so surprised that this has happened, they actually stop for a second. The attacker just kind of sits up on her back and says, "Can I just go?" And Melissa says, "No." But at that exact moment, the attacker leapt up and started running back towards the blue minivan. And so she jumps up. She's still got the knife in her hand. Melissa runs to her car. She leaps inside. She throws the knife onto the floorboard of the passenger seat. After making sure Remy is in the car with her, she shuts the back hatch, she locks the doors, and then she turns around and she sees her attacker in the van peeling out of the lot driving away. And so she fires up her car and she drives to the hospital. After getting 15 stitches, a man named Joel Klossing, who was a detective, he came into the room and he took down Melissa's statement. Melissa had the most incredible memory of the event. She knew exactly what her attacker looked like, all the little details, and she knew everything about the vehicle, to include the fact that she knew it was a Dodge Caravan minivan. Detective Klossing, he goes back and he has a composite sketch made of the attacker, and then on this sheet that showed the attacker, there was a description of the vehicle and where it was located and some details of the case. And so Detective Klossing releases this sketch and the information to the media, and someone would come forward. One day after Jesse had been killed, a deputy came forward and said, "Hey, I saw your flyer and I have seen that vehicle parked in the exact same spot. There was something weird about it. The driver was acting strange. And so I actually ran the license plates. And so I can pull those plates that I ran and we can see who owned that vehicle, and maybe it's a match." And when they looked at the owner of that minivan, there was just no way they matched the description that Melissa gave. But when Detective Klossing looked a little bit deeper, he would discover they had a relative that matched exactly the description that Melissa gave of her attacker. Detective Klossing tracks down the phone number of the relative who looks exactly like the attacker, and he punches that number into his cell phone. At the same time, Buck and Joy Blodgett were hosting a vigil for their daughter in their home. And so all of Jesse's very close friends and family, they were all there. A phone starts to ring inside of this circle. And the owner of that phone, 19-year-old Daniel Bartelt, who was a very close friend of Jesse's and who had spent much of that summer coming over to the Blodgett household to make original music with Jesse, he stands up and he walks quietly away from the group, and then he answers the phone, and it's Detective Klossing asking Daniel to come into the station to talk about Melissa Richards. Daniel would make his way to the police station that afternoon, and he would be interviewed by Detective Klossing and another detective. It was not lost on these detectives how strange it was that Daniel is at the home of a recently murdered young woman, and he is now the suspect of another attack on another young woman. Detective Klossing kind of casually asks him, "Hey, why were you at Jesse Blodgett's house when I called you?" And Daniel would say, well, I'm very close with Jesse, and so we were there as part of her vigil because she was killed yesterday. And so the detective kind of did gradually shift to Melissa Richards, which Daniel would say he had nothing to do with. But as they began asking him questions about Melissa, Detective Clausing and the other detective noticed that there were cuts on Daniel's hands. And they asked Daniel, how'd you get these cuts on your hands? And Daniel was very quick to say, well, I got them at work. A screw kind of jutted out and cut my hands. One of the detectives just says to Daniel, if I were to call your employer, would they say you, Daniel, are currently employed with them? And Daniel, he kind of paused for a minute and then said, no, I actually lost my job several weeks ago. And so Detective Clausing kind of leans in and says, Daniel, why don't you just tell us the truth? And amazingly, Daniel would. He would admit, after some serious pressure, that he hurt himself attacking Melissa Richards. He didn't want his parents to know he had lost his job. He was pretending to be at work by sitting in that parking space. He saw Melissa, and he decided he just wanted to attack her. When asked if he had any connection to the Jesse Blodgett murder, he would say, absolutely not. I love Jesse. I would never hurt her. But when Detective Clausing reached out to Detective Thickens, it would quickly come to light that Daniel was lying again. Daniel was raised in a good, loving family. I mean, this was a kid who had everything going for him. But something went wrong with Daniel, and no one knows exactly why. Daniel had become obsessed with killing and death and murder. His internet search history shows that he spent a lot of time looking for actual snuff videos. He also spent a lot of time looking up serial killers and spree killers, had discovered this one particular snuff film, and Daniel watched this video over and over and over and over again. As Daniel is pretending to be at work, he's sitting in his car, he looks out and he sees Melissa, she's all alone, and something clicks in his head where he decides he's going to go reenact that snuff film on Melissa. And so Melissa was likely just at the wrong place at the wrong time. 3 days later, Daniel decided he wanted to try again. And this time, he wasn't going to leave it up to some random victim. And who better than 19-year-old Jesse Blodgett, his close friend who inherently trusted him and would easily let him into her house. It's believed Daniel arrived in the driveway of the Blodgett household just a few minutes after Buck and Joy had left for work. Daniel, he entered the house, and when he went inside, he was prepared for what he was about to do. He literally had a bag full of supplies. Things like that special tape, there were ligatures, cords, ropes. After she was deceased, he kind of repositioned her in her bed with the covers up over her to give the appearance that she was still sleeping to her parents. Then Daniel rounded up all of his murder supplies back into his bag, except he did accidentally leave one of those special rolls of tape underneath Jesse's bed. And then he slipped out of the Blodgett household, and then he drove to Woodlawn Park, where he disposed of his supplies into one of the trash cans. The next day, at Jesse's vigil, Daniel would attend, and according to the other people that were there, Daniel was by far the most talkative person in that circle. Daniel would ultimately be found guilty of murdering Jesse Blodgett, although he never admitted guilt. In fact, during the sentencing phase, Buck Blodgett would give this incredibly eloquent and heart-wrenching speech. Buck turned and he looked directly at Daniel, and Daniel looked back at him, and Buck says, "Dan, I forgive you as I have every day since I found out it was you." And then a few moments later, Buck would also say to Dan, "Dan, not only do I forgive you, but I love you." But when Daniel got his turn, he would tell them that he's innocent and that he doesn't have any answers for them because he didn't do it and his conscience is clear. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and as far as we know, he still denies having killed Jesse despite the mountain of evidence against him. In the days following Jesse's death, Buck Blodgett walked into his daughter's bedroom and he laid down on her bed, and looking straight up, he tried to hold his breath for as long as he possibly could. He started to imagine what it was like for his poor daughter in her final moments as she's being murdered, and it just crushed him. He thought to himself, I wasn't there for my little girl when she needed me the most. Buck would go on to start the Love is Greater Than Hate project, which is this incredible charity whose mission is designed to end male-on-female violence and to inspire love over hate. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.